Forensic accounting is not a new topic, and the public ledger system around which cryptocurrencies are built, on the one hand, opens that process to anyone wanting to get involved. But on the other hand, since the blockchain is a ledger not just for an individual or company, but rather that it covers the entire network, there's a pretty unreasonable amount of data, and also highly incomplete information about what identities control which addresses within that data. This is something that we ran headlong into recently on a story where we were trying to run down essentially where money was routed after the DEA supposedly took possession of a number of Bitcoins. We really were not able to get too much further past determining that it did in fact go into the system and kind of continued moving around a lot from there. I'm here with Martin Harrigan today from Quantabytes, who is working on solving some of these problems and actually has done, as far as I can tell, just about more blockchain forensics than anybody else in this space. Martin, thanks for joining us this evening.
Hi, Adam.
You're a principal at Quantabytes. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do there?
Quantabytes is just a kind of an amateur effort so far to provide tools for analyzing and visualizing the blockchain. So what we want to do is we want to take this thing called the blockchain, this fundamental data structure that Bitcoin is essentially built on, and provide some tools that will allow people to get better insight into what's actually going on there. As your listeners probably know, the blockchain is essentially this distributed ledger. So it's this a public account of which addresses own which Bitcoins. And the interesting thing about the blockchain is that it's publicly available. In fact, in order to participate in the Bitcoin network, the first thing your Bitcoin client has to do is it has to download the blockchain. And what we can do is we can perform different kinds of analysis on this blockchain to try and monitor and watch the flows of Bitcoin over time. So what we're trying to do is provide some tools that will enable this type of analysis, essentially.
So right now, this is something where you're right. There aren't a lot of tools out there, and it's exciting to hear that you're developing some. What can we do right now, looking at the blockchain as a whole? What can we learn from it at this point with the limited tools that are available?
Okay, so the type of things we can do, I think, can be broken down into two categories. You can do macro type analysis, first of all, where you can essentially look at high-level statistics over time. So the simplest things are already being done. There's charts on many websites that show, for instance, the number of transactions over time, the quantity of, say, Bitcoins that are residing at different addresses. You can look at how the distribution of these balances change over time. So, for instance, are addresses holding smaller balances as time progresses or as the value of Bitcoin increases? Now, there's other more advanced things. Then you can look at measures like Bitcoin days destroyed, which is a metric sort of similar to the velocity of money, and this can give you an indication of whether old or new Bitcoins are being spent. On the other side, then you can look at micro-type analysis. So you can try and zoom in on a particular transaction or a particular group of addresses you're interested in, and you can try and piece together actually what happened here. So was someone trying to consolidate a bunch of Bitcoins together? Were they trying to obfuscate the flow of Bitcoins by mixing them or sending them through some long chain of addresses? And you, for one reason or another, you can try and get some insight into what maybe the person was trying to do. We also, myself and a colleague, about a year and a half, or actually 2 years ago now, we looked into the case. Could you actually identify who some of these participants were by looking at activity in the blockchain? And again, if you take the blockchain in isolation, there is very little you can say about who's performing what. But in some cases, if you mix it in with, say, third-party data sources, so say if you have some other information that might attach Bitcoin addresses to IP addresses or something like this, you might be able to piece together in some cases who is involved in which transactions. And again, to stress here, the general answer is that you can't say who is behind a given, say, public key or something like that. But in some cases, you might be able to piece it together. And this could be important maybe if someone is performing an investigation or if they're trying to work out maybe just searching for clues or something like this. It's one thing that they can look into.
So you mentioned that there's, you've got the micro side and you've got the macro side. one of the things that we ran into is that the only parties we were able to identify in our investigation, trying to figure out where these Bitcoins went, was we were able to at least get pretty close to saying that at least 10% of the coins that went through this particular address we were looking at some point in their life cycle after this incident, went through an exchange called BTCE, because we were able to correlate a 3 days worth of downtime, essentially, where that was a time where that address had not been active. So I mean that was kind of a lucky thing where we were able to make that connection, and actually it was with the help of a listener who gave us kind of some information about that side of it. I mean, do you think that when you introduce the tools that you're talking about, how much data is going to be available at that point? Is it, identifying, or is there always going to be this requirement for third-party outside information if you want to get real deep?
Yes, I think you will always need some third-party source of information. If you take the blockchain on its own, I think no matter how sophisticated your tools are, there are still very hard limits as to what you can learn. However, if you take the example of someone who might have access to additional information, if I pick, like, just to pick one for example, if you pick someone who operates a website like blockexplorer.com or blockchain.info or something like this, they are potentially gathering a lot of very, very interesting information about what IP addresses are being used to access what account balances. And again, if you had access to this type of information and you had some correlation between access logs on a web server and what actual public key addresses people are looking at, you wouldn't be able to, of course, draw any conclusions as to who owns what, but you would be able to see over time potentially who are interested, like which people are interested in which public keys. And this type of information people can leak without really realizing. So you might have, a small balance of Bitcoins that you keep in some public key address, and you might have put them in cold storage. But then you may have a habit of just checking that address occasionally by looking at the balance on a website like Block Explorer or blockchain.info. And it's kind of interesting to think that third party would then have that type of information. So if they were to say correlate, sorry, I'm going to have to start again.
No, that's fine. That's
fine. If they were to correlate accesses, say people accessing through a certain IP address and the balances that were in certain accounts, then they might be able to learn interesting things that way as well.
That's really interesting. So the greatest leaks, or at least the most obvious leaks here, are really these centralized services where you can check accounts, because, the accounts that I would check, I might check ones of people that I know, I might check ones of people who, not necessarily people, but I might just check addresses that I'm interested in, and I would also check my own. And so by capturing that and associating with an IP address, then you're able to really, really narrow down, okay, this IP address has an interest in this one, and start building networks of essentially correlations. Is that possible if you're not using a service like blockchain? Like if I never go to blockchain.info or I never go to one of these outside address checkers, then do I leak that information through using my Bitcoin client, or is it just an online thing?
It's just essentially an online thing. If you are very careful, it's certainly possible to use Bitcoin in a way that you won't leak information like this. Having said that, there is still the potential, even though I haven't actually seen it deployed, where someone, for instance, if they were connected to your local Bitcoin client at the peer-to-peer level, say if that same person was also connected to a large portion of other nodes on the peer-to-peer network, and say if they saw, for example, that a new transaction appeared from your node first. Of course, they can't say with certainty, but they might be able to make the guess that the transaction actually originated from your client. Now, again, it is possible to work around this, and it's possible if the person who's operating the client knows what they're doing to do things so that this can't happen. But in the general case, it is possible that someone could leak information like that.
One of the other questions that I've had, there are people out there who use one public address for just about everything. I've seen this before, and it always surprises me because it's very, very easy to make another address and to just use a new address basically with every transaction. The way that I wind up treating it is almost like a checkbook memo space where you can write a little note about what that exact transaction was for, so you can keep it for your records later. Is there a difference in terms of security and in terms of how much information you're putting out there if you're using a unique address for each transaction you do, or if you're using one for everything?
There is, certainly. If you take, say, the Bitcoin QT client as an example, when you send Bitcoins using that piece of software, there isn't like a from field like there is in an email client. Essentially, all you do is you paste in the public key of the address you want to send the Bitcoins to. But under the hood, the client does actually use a type of from field. I'm kind of simplifying a little. If you want to send 100 Bitcoins to someone else, your client has to create a transaction where it indicates where those 100 Bitcoins came from. And if you only ever accept Bitcoins using one address, then of course those 100 Bitcoins have to come from that address. So you've essentially said in this new transaction that I'm transferring 100 Bitcoins from this old address, which I've already publicly said I own, and I'm sending it to this new address. And of course, that's very easy for someone who is analyzing the blockchain to see that. Now, if you go a step further and you start creating unique addresses every time you want to receive some new Bitcoins, then essentially what the client does is it'll pick a subset of your existing addresses and consolidate together some Bitcoin from those addresses and send it on to the new person. The danger here, if you're using the standard client, is you can't really tell how it essentially put these Bitcoins together. So which of your previous addresses did it use when it was creating this new transaction? This can kind of surprise people, I think, because what they might have is they might have one, say, public key that they use for receiving donations, and then maybe they've used other unique addresses for receiving other amounts. But then when they go to make a transaction, what actually happens is the client might consolidate together some Bitcoins from your public address and from a subset of your private addresses. What the transaction then shows, and again, there are ways around this, but in the general case, what it shows is that all those addresses at the time of the transaction were under the control of the same person. So again, you've sort of given away the fact that the person who owns the public address and the person who owns a subset of these private addresses is actually the same person. I think this is very non-intuitive to some people when they use the Bitcoin client for the first time, because all they see in the UI, for instance, is that they're pasting in this new public key address. It's a hexadecimal string of letters and numbers. It all looks very anonymous. And there's no indication what information they've just given away. And what they've actually given away is that of the other addresses that are in my wallet, I'm grouping together a bunch of Bitcoins in order to make this new transaction. And I think that can surprise people sometimes.
One of the other things that I've been noticing as I kind of go around the internet is that, especially on Bitcoin-centric sites or just altcoin, this is not specific to Bitcoin, of course. This is any sort of cryptocurrency we're really talking about here. It's just that Bitcoin is the largest player right now. There's a common practice of pasting a Bitcoin public address in like forum profiles and things that really identify people to those particular things. That's basically like an even larger breach than you would get with one of these blockchain.info services, right? I mean, because you're just flat out associating identity with address.
Yes, exactly. What's dangerous then is that those addresses can potentially be linked with private addresses that you're also using. So even though you might have only disclosed one address, you might have 6 or 7 other addresses that you don't disclose, but in the course of making transactions using your client, you might indicate that it's possible that the same person actually owns all of the addresses.
So from even that one public address, if someone is looking hard enough, they can track it back and see if there are other correlations where that, you're saying that the balance that comes from that publicly displayed address can be combined with other non-publicly displayed ones, which then creates a correlation, which makes it so that, if someone wanted to look, they can say, okay, well, this person, this transaction combined this, and this. We know that this person owns at least this address, and that implies that since these other addresses are in the same transaction, they are also owned by that same person who publicly displayed.
Yes, exactly. And even though there are ways around this, so it is possible for someone to deny this. It's not like a hard and fast proof that they own them. But what I would say is that in a lot of cases, in general use, it would be a good indicator that the same person is in control of the different addresses, yes. We gave the example before of the WikiLeaks website. Again, it's about 2 years ago. They broadcast a tweet. This was in the earlier days of Bitcoin, saying that they were accepting anonymous donations on this address, and they gave a Bitcoin public key. And people then may have made anonymous donations to this address. What they may not have realized is that in doing so, anyone who saw that public key address could easily identify all the transactions that were donations. And then they could take a look at what keys did those transactions originate from? And then they could see, could they identify any of those people? So just by sending Bitcoins to that address, it certainly didn't guarantee that you were anonymous. And if you take that a step further, what they've moved to now is every time you make a donation, they generate a new address. And that's certainly better. But the danger is that, say someone automatically makes a small donation every week and they keep a record of what address WikiLeaks used to receive that donation. They could then monitor the blockchain to see if the balances in those addresses were ever linked together with other addresses. So if they knew, say, 50 addresses that they had used to make say, donations to WikiLeaks, they could see whether those 50 addresses were ever linked with other addresses. And in doing so, they could make an educated guess that all those addresses were in fact used for donations to WikiLeaks. And that's potentially dangerous, I think.
So let's talk about mixer services for a second here. This is definitely something we ran into going through this investigation, trying to figure out what exactly happened. And what wound up happening is it looked like it went through a series of probably about 100 mixer transactions, where the full amount goes through and a small amount peels off and goes somewhere else and then starts its own little side chain. And basically, the point isn't that you can actually eliminate the connections. The point is that you can confuse the connections by throwing so much information out. Is that right? So is that effective? Can you actually hide with mixer transactions, or is it just make it more difficult?
If you have a public key that has a certain balance and you want to try and obfuscate it or obscure that fact, you can first try to, say, divide that balance into smaller amounts, send them through a series of different addresses, maybe join them together at a later date. And if you do this on your own, it certainly makes it more difficult to see. In the blockchain, you would have to look at the flow of Bitcoins over time. Even though it's deniable, I would say you haven't completely obscured the fact that you still own these Bitcoins. So there are techniques from network analysis and graph analysis where you can follow the flow of something like Bitcoins over time. And again, you could see that maybe 100 or 200 transactions later, the person merged together flows from several different transactions, and you can see that they brought them back together again. And again, someone could make an educated guess that it's the same person is in control of this. You could thereby say that you could maybe follow the flow of Bitcoins over time. Now, again, it's very deniable. The person who did it could claim that the very minute they left the first address, they didn't own them after that. It's certainly not completely obscured. And if you were looking for a clue as to where to investigate next, it might point you to another centralized service, a wallet or a mixer that you could maybe contact and see if they could tell you who was in control of a certain address. I think you can try to obscure and hide it by doing these types of things, but it's not clear whether it would always be successful. I think it's interesting to note in this case, in some, say, reported robberies of Bitcoins in the past, what used to happen maybe a year and a half ago is you would often see these types of obfuscated, obscured flows after a robbery, say, would occur. But more lately, some of the more recent robberies, they don't actually happen like this. What happens is the Bitcoins are stolen and they generally stay in some address. There's potentially two reasons for this. I mean, first is that maybe the person who stole the Bitcoins is just speculating that the price is going to rise in the future and they don't want to cash out yet. But I think more likely is that it's not clear how best you would actually move these Bitcoins to, say, an exchange so that you could cash out without anybody ever finding out it was you. I don't think it's immediately obvious how you could do that completely anonymously at the moment.
So with Quantabytes, you're building some tools to make some of this process of being able to, essentially extract information from the blockchain, both in the macro and micro sense. What tools are you specifically pushing towards? What areas do you think really need the work?
There's essentially three different types of tools I hope to provide. The first is just some simple tools for processing and parsing the blockchain. Even though the blockchain is publicly available and anyone who's running the Bitcoin Qt client essentially has a copy of this, I think it could be in a format that would make it easier for certain types of analysis. Now, some people have already made an effort of this where you can download kind of human readable versions of the blockchain. This is the I hope to provide. The second thing will be a collection of network analysis tools. So these will be things where you could identify a certain public key you're interested in, and then you could visualize the flow of Bitcoins from this address over time. So you could watch for, say, very fast flows. If someone had a certain balance in a certain account and they wanted to quickly move it between a series of accounts, it could identify things like that. It could watch for, say, large balances of Bitcoins being divided over time, then merged and consolidated back together again, and maybe smaller portions being siphoned off. things like this, which you can do with network analysis. And the third thing is tools for visualizing this kind of output. This type of analysis is something that really needs a human, where they can look at the accounts, they can look at the addresses, they can try and see what was happening over time. And again, there are some tools from network analysis that can help to actually draw these types of pictures. That's essentially the three types of tools I hope to provide.
If you are trying to do something private on the blockchain, is this a concern for you? Do you think this is something that the average user needs to be concerned about? I mean, regardless of whether or not they want something to be private, I think there's an expectation when you're dealing with Bitcoin that these transactions are private. So is that a wrong assumption, or is there still so much data out there that it is pretty much anonymous? It is pretty much safe no matter what?
That's a difficult question, because if you do something, I think, using Bitcoin at the moment, maybe no one will find out, say, that you've performed a certain transaction. But in doing so, you have to make sure that no one in the future will be able to look back and piece together the information. And also you have to make sure that you won't do anything in the future that will disclose some information that might reveal what you did. So again, to make an example, you might make a perfectly anonymous donation to some Bitcoin address using some Bitcoins that you hadn't in any way linked to your public identity. But the danger is maybe in a year's time, you might make another transaction that might link together one of the addresses used in that transaction with some other address that maybe could be linked with your public identity. I suppose what I would say is that you certainly can't assume that everything you do in Bitcoin is completely anonymous. If you really want it to be, you have to be very careful and very sure that you know what you're doing.
So, Martin, this is clearly, a developing issue. If someone listening to this is interested and wants to get in touch with you or join the project, what's the procedure for that?
The website is quantabytes.com, and you can contact me at martin@quantabytes.com.
Well, thank you very much for your perspective, Martin. This is a really interesting topic, and I think it's really poorly understood, so I really appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Okay, thanks. It was great talking with you.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news. It's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.